Corebase is part of a generation of tools. It's really built to make cybersecurity easier. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the MSP Cyber Roundtable. We've got Uncle Marv, also sometimes known as Marvin Bee, and we've got Chris Regan with us. So Uncle Marvin, of course, from the IT Business Podcast, if you've seen it on YouTube, and Chris Regan, who is, and I'm excited about this because we haven't done this before. We have a cyber/privacy attorney with us today, who gets to tell us when we're speaking outside the lines, maybe. Keep us honest. And it's part of a 3-part series. So we're going to go left to boom, what we should be doing to protect people, and then we're going to talk about, in another episode, which is next week on the IT Business Podcast. We're going to be talking about the moment things go bad and how you should be dealing with incidents, right? How should you be researching? How should you be analyzing? How should you be investigating? When is something an incident? When should you not use the B word? And then we have a third part, and we're going to get into cyber insurance. So that'll be a couple weeks from now. Marv, you've been with us before, and I want to get back to an intro on you in a moment. But since Chris is here for the first time today, Chris, I would love to hear a little bit of a story about yourself. But before we get into the story, I want to know, since it's a Friday, we're about to go into the weekend. Do you have a weekend plan that involves any kind of food or cooking that you think like you're super excited to get into?
I mean, nothing planned specifically. I've got a little one, so I'm sure I'll be cooking for him. But other than that, nothing too exciting set up for the weekend.
What's the favorite thing to cook your little one on a Saturday morning that he gets super excited about, which makes you, I presume, excited?
For a Saturday morning, I'm going to say bacon. That's one of his favorites for that type of a morning. He really loves that for a morning one, so I'll go with that. Nothing complicated or difficult, just bacon in a cast iron.
All right. Well, hopefully there's bacon in your near future. So I introduced you as a privacy attorney, but why don't you give me a more maybe specific label? And then what I would love to hear is how you ended up there. How did you end up in legal? How did you end up in cyber legal? How did you end up specializing around privacy, which is like a real journey, I think.
I was always kind of interested in legal. I did mock trial through high school and college and law school. I decided to. I ended up at Notre Dame for law school. Went to the Bronx District Attorney's Office to start out my legal career, and the technology there was just so bad that I realized that even someone who knew as little about technology as me at that point could do better. So I started learning how to program and learned all about computer crimes and identity theft, and really got into all of that type of privacy and cybersecurity from the criminal side. And then an opportunity opened with the New York City Cyber Command, a relatively new agency at that point, which defends the city of New York against all of the cybersecurity attacks that come in. um, and sets all the policies and standards. So I helped set up all of that for the city of New York, policies on everything from encryption to how to deal with a ransomware attack when it inevitably happens, and worked on the instant response for all of those, and worked there for a few years. After I was there for a few years, I got my CIPP US, my CIPM was recognized by the American Bar Association and the International Association of Privacy Professionals as a privacy law specialist. Then went to MasterCard, worked on developing their privacy US regime, and then after that, I've been working at a law firm and been working for a couple relatively new companies like Fort Mesa since then, doing different privacy and cybersecurity compliance and legal, depending on who I'm working for.
Well, let me ask about that PLS, that privacy law specialist label, because
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, this is not that specialty is even more specific than the world of cyber losses, right? Because there's different types of cyber losses, right? But I
Yeah.
think privacy is where it's the most tangled, because the impacts are the least clear to define and to defend against. I think, if a system's up, it's up. If it's down, it's down, right? And that's simple to understand. And there's business impact to that, right? But in the world of data theft, right, the privacy impact is the biggest hairball that we have to deal with as service providers, right? And so you've got this specialty, and it was really interesting for me to hear how few true privacy law specialists there are out there. So I forget what number you gave me, but this is the U.S.
Uh,
globally. What's the
yeah, it's a U.S. Thing. You have to have more than one IAPP certification, including the CIPP US. You have to have a certain amount of percentage of your practice be in privacy law, in practicing privacy law. You have to have done a certain amount of education in privacy law in the 5 years previous. You have to get peer recommendations and put in an application to be approved. And last I checked, there were less than 120 of us in the U.S.
So if we just presume that population norms sort of like map to PLS certifications, not even every state in this country has a privacy law specialist. Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's and it makes sense given the state of how people are protecting privacy for consumers, which in this country is not as good as they should be, right?
Should be is where the debate comes in.
Right. I'll let you. We're gonna come back to that because I want to introduce Marvin, but before we're gonna jump like really deep into that today. So Marv, give us the quick 30-second MB Systems IT business podcast thing.
So for those that do not know, I run an IT shop here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Started in 1997 solely because the computer repair shop that I worked in at the time would not do on-site service. So I, as the manager of the tech department, said, well, I'm going to go do service. I had to do it at night or on the weekends. But that's how I started this business when I finally told him I can do better on my own than here in the shop. And he challenged me, and here I am 28 years later, still doing it.
I'll
And
bet yeah, those retail shops are gone, right?
well, that one is. There's a couple around, but yeah, they're not as prevalent as they once were. So that's the day job, and the night job, in a sense, is the podcast. I host the IT Business Podcast, a show for IT professionals where we talk about running your business better, smarter, and faster.
So And you have a specialty, right? Which is sort of an interesting thing here today, because Chris comes from the legal side, right? But your specialty is servicing from a technical perspective,
Yeah,
the legal side, right?
I kind of accidentally fell into becoming somebody that dealt primarily with law firms. And so it was never the intent, but the legal industry is one of those where somebody like me, I don't market. I never did. I never, went out and cold called or anything like that. I got my business through referrals. And lawyers are fairly good at referring business. So
Yeah.
they account for 70% of my business.
Yeah. So that's a great focus number, and I think pretty much everyone who's listening to this should think about how they can focus their practice, right? So I'm going to just do the quick intro lecture on Left to Boom. With that, let's jump in. So we are here. Oh, so uh, Chris is messaging me out of the corner here. Yes, Chris, we will start straight there after this this intro. Okay. All right. So we are here to just talk, like, just to sort of frame today's conversation, which is that we're talking today about things that are left of boom. We're not going to talk about the actual bad thing that could happen, right? Or the questionable thing that you observe. We're going to talk about all the things you should be doing to prevent that, right? The it exists, left to boom exists in this sort of spectrum, or this timeline, right? You've got the things leading up to an incident, or sometimes just an event or an anomaly, and then you have the things that follow that. This terminology comes from the military, clearly, but it's widely used in the IT industry to refer to sort of the life cycle of an event, right? There's all the things that led up to it, and then there's the event, and then there's the things that followed. When we think about, this is the NIST 6 functions here on the screen. When we think about the life cycle of a cybersecurity program, what's in a cybersecurity program, we're moving from left to right, and governing a cybersecurity program, that's a function that happens left to boom. It happens during an incident. It happens after an incident. But typically, left to boom processes begin to identify on the technical side. You need to find the systems. You need to understand where your data is. Then you move into protecting that data, the systems, the people. And then once you've done a pretty good job of protecting, you need to make sure that you have detective systems in place, and that you have detections in place, so that if an incident happens, right, if a bad thing happens, if a boom happens, you even know, right? Because unfortunately, if you don't have good detection in place, you won't learn about it until you hit that ransom message, right? But there's usually lots of opportunities to detect before that happens. So just in terms of importance, left to boom is typically the type of security that's less cost, right? It's higher return on investment. It's typically much cheaper to prevent a bad thing from happening than to actively thwart attackers in real time or clean up after them. So that's the focus, right? Is prevention. Also, even if it had nothing to do with cost, organizations have a responsibility to protect their stakeholders. So you are actually, and Chris in a moment I'm sure is going to have something to say about this, but not being an attorney, I'm just going to say the thing I say, which is organizations and the stakeholders in them, they have a responsibility. They have a due care responsibility to care, and then to do something about protecting, to prevent harm, not to recover from harm, right? And how people can be held accountable depends on industry and where you are in the world. But ultimately, organizations, and in some cases, actual managers or executives in that business, can be held accountable for failures of due care and due diligence. And it's not just the CISO. The CISO is the named officer, if you have one. and hopefully you do, but other people can also be held accountable as well. So that's why there's lots of standards for this. We'll talk more about that a little later, but if you're looking for a reference, CIS controls are typically the place I recommend service providers look, because they're prioritized. You start at the cheap stuff at the top, expensive stuff at the bottom. That's a great way to go. You could also look at NIST CSF, which is what the federal government here in the U.S. has been recommending. And then you've got the higher level standards, NIST 853 and ISO 27000, which of course has international renown. So with that's the framing for Left to Boom. And before we get into anything more tangible than that, Chris, I know that you wanted to make sure you frame your presence here in this call today before you say anything about cyber. So go do the thing.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad to be here, but while I'm an attorney, I have to make it clear that this podcast doesn't create any sort of attorney-client relationship with the listeners. The content provided here is for educational and entertainment purposes only, should not be considered legal advice for you specifically. You should always seek the advice of a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction regarding your specific legal matters. The views and opinions that I express on this podcast are mine alone and do not reflect the views of any organization I'm affiliated with. There goes your legal blurb for the day.
I like the short version better, which was can I say that? that Chris is definitely a lawyer and he's a privacy attorney, but he's not your lawyer unless you paid him or his firm. So everyone should have an attorney, at least if they're in this business. So with that, one of the things I really wanted to crack open today was this frame of like, what is the legal responsibility here? Because everything that we actually do should, particularly around, so there's, let me back up a little bit. There's two reasons why you should be acting Left to Boom. One is to stop losses to an organization internally, right? Like literally financial impact, right? And organizations should be self-motivated there, right? And sometimes they need help understanding their level of risk and what they can do about it, right? And service providers step in there. But they also have a responsibility to people from afar, right? They have this responsibility to consumers in many cases, to regulators in some cases, or really in almost any cases, there's some type of regulatory handle. They've got responsibilities to their business partners, whether they be B2B customers or vendors or other types of partners where there's a binding legal requirement to protect someone else's information. So there's all sorts of constraints that set the level of expectation on what someone should be doing about cybersecurity. Set sort of an expectation of a minimum, and we've been using this term for 500 years. I think this idea of reasonable things someone should be doing. And we write this into contracts all the time. It says reasonable precaution, reasonable security, commercially reasonable security. I've seen it written 10 different ways, right? But what it comes down to is, and it's in regulations too. It's in laws like HIPAA, right? It says you should be using commercially reasonable practices, right? You're supposed to do the things that are reasonable. And Chris is laughing because like basically we, as a provider, I'm always like, oh, that's just like whatever the lawyers like think is reasonable. And Chris, you're laughing because you told me like it doesn't really mean anything to lawyers either, right? Like what I mean, it's not entirely true. What's your opinion here?
Yeah. So, reasonable is a lawyer's favorite word because reasonable means job security for the lawyer. Reasonable is an ever-changing standard where you have to weigh everything, and the attorney can say, I'm giving you my advice on what's reasonable, but my advice on what's reasonable is based on what you told me, and that there's this set of information that I know, but like it's weighing, it's a scale, it's you put anything new on there and the scale is now different and reasonable is now different, and you have to, reasonable gets evaluated by different people in different ways. Are you in front of a regulator? Or are you in front of your shareholders? Are you in front of a jury in a lawsuit? Are you dealing with a vendor in a contract? Like it gets interpreted differently depending on the situation, depending on who you are, depending on what you have. There's so many things that go into reasonable. So that's why I laugh when you say that reasonable is the key thing. I mean, it is, but it's also something
Well,
that you're never going to get anyone to 100% pin down that this, you have to do this. This is always reasonable, and this is not, unless it's something that is just so blatant.
well, I maybe you've been in situations where you think, oh man, that was a close call. But in the world of cyber, I don't see so many of those close calls. Usually it's very clear that someone thought about what they were doing, weighed the consequences, the costs, the benefits, and took the right action, or they were negligent. And
Mhm.
usually what I see is not a lot of, sometimes there's in between, like, yeah, I could see it either way. But oftentimes it's, well, there was this standard practice and there's a specific list of things and they did half of it and they didn't even try to do the other half, right? I see that a
Mhm.
lot. And
Well,
then I see, well, they
Matt,
tried really hard. Yeah, go ahead.
we all see that
Yeah.
because what's reasonable in our eyes may not be reasonable in our client's eyes. I have this all the time where the owner of a business they'll listen to you, you know, recommend all the steps, and this is best practice. This is what, everybody does. And the owner will say, well, that's reasonable for other businesses, but not for mine.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
have to wait.
that's a very common thing that we deal with when we look at situations and try to determine if something's reasonable. I mean, you have to look at who is the company that you're dealing with. What do they have? Do they have people's tax records, or do they have their public social media posts, or what are they holding on to? Because certain things are more sensitive than others, and some companies have more of that and some companies have less of that, and some companies are bigger and some companies are smaller, and some are in regulated industries and some are not. You have to weigh all of these things together to figure out, there's best practices, but best practices are usually something that gets put out as this is what's best for this industry. But if you are the behemoth in the industry, you're going to be held to a higher standard than everyone else. And if you're the brand new little guy who's just starting out and does almost nothing, you're going to be held to a lesser standard. There may be certain things that are locked in because you have a regulation that specifies something specifically. If you're in the payment card industry, and you've got the PCI DSS standard is going to put certain requirements on that you have to follow, no matter what, no matter how small you are, you have to follow those. Doesn't mean you can't go more, and doesn't mean that depending on your situation, you may not be held to a higher standard than that. But that's going to be a floor for you in that sort of situation. But if you're in a completely unrelated industry, you may not have those same sort of hard and fast floor standards that you have to get.
Well, I know you're right, and there's some verticals that still don't have super prescriptive requirements here in the U.S. But more, I mean, I wish it was less piecemeal than it is, and less like patchwork quilt. But we are seeing pretty much every vertical slash geography attacked by their legislators, right, to address this issue. We saw over the last like 3 or 4 years, we saw K-12 schools in most places now have cyber regulations. We saw GLBA, which has been around for 20 years, extended to cover like car dealerships within the last 5 years, right? Because car dealerships didn't used to be considered financial services organizations, right? They weren't considered banks. They weren't the ones lending money in most cases. But now, because of this regulatory roll up and rule change, um, they have to follow FTC safeguards, right? which, and if you follow along, is like anyone who's doing like those payday loan things, right? Or help financing a thing with consumers, right? They're all rolled up into that now, right? Which is like most of the retail space, right? So we have all of that. We have, if you're in a school, if you're in a government agency, we have clearly financial services has, and unfortunately, financial services is in like, it's not one industry, right? But they're all well regulated for the most part. We've got the healthcare industry, which hasn't had an update since 2013, but clearly has a regulatory standard. And unfortunately, the current set of rules, and they're going to be updated probably later this year, but the current set of rules are a bit mushy. But there are 19 things you have to do, right, in HIPAA that you have no choice in. And people sometimes don't do all those things. And in the last couple of years, I'm going to tell you, it's rare for me to go into an organization and do a regulatory evaluation and say, oh, there's no regulatory impact here, right? There's usually something. But maybe I'm only getting, I've got a confirmation bias because I'm the compliance guy and I get called in like a firefighter, right? Do you think, are there large sectors of the economy where there's literally, it's still the Wild West?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in retail and other things like that aren't regulated in quite that same way. The areas, yeah, legal, and I mean, most everyone gets called in to help out those highly regulated sectors the most, and that's partially because since they are regulated, they have to put the most money into these things, and so they call, whether it's tech or compliance or legal, call us in to help them get set up because those are such widely known regulations that they don't really have a choice.
Yeah. Well, healthcare is really interesting because if we rewound 10 years, they were like the least secure vertical. And then, maybe 15 years. And then HIPAA came and really pushed them to the front of the pack. Maybe they're falling behind again, but it was driven by legislation, right? And the same thing's going on right now in some other sectors. So we have the manufacturing sector, which until very recently, it was probably the least cyber secure place in the economy. It really wasn't well regulated, even though you could consider heavy industry and even retail industry, as we saw in COVID. There's some really important stuff that gets made that is critical to the functioning of civilization, but it wasn't well regulated, right? And now we have improved FARS rules, at the federal government level, and the CMMC rule that went into enforcement a few weeks ago, and it's taking this sector of the economy that was the furthest behind, right, and dragging it forward to basically the furthest ahead in cybersecurity. And it seems like that's just the way we operate here, right? In any case, I've been talking too much. I'm curious, Marvin, how do you navigate this with your clients? Because you were saying, it might not be right for them, but ultimately you have to arrive at something at the end of the day, right? How do you decide?
You try to, and it's part of the negotiations, right? And I'm going to say, from my perspective, the legal industry is still one of those industries that has an issue with, what's reasonable, because at the end of the day, most attorneys think, well, if there's an issue, I'll just take it to court and they'll figure it out there. And I fight all the time with attorneys that are like, well, we don't want to spend anything until we have to. And unless you're a title attorney or a family law attorney where you're actually dealing with other people's money, there are things in place to protect those. But I have several insurance defense law firms where they wouldn't do anything until their clients, which are the insurance companies, actually put in place, these are the security measures that you need to follow if you want to keep getting cases from us. So for a long time, my attorneys, they weren't protecting their data. They were protecting their flow of cases from their clients. And so finally now I'm able to, approach it from a different perspective. It's not just that case flow we need to protect. We need to protect that data because they're asking you to. So now their eyes are kind of opening to that. And you had mentioned the fact that if you deal with stuff left of boom, it's going to cost less. They don't see it that way because that's now added something to their line item expense that in their eyes, it's more because they didn't have to spend it before. So the argument that I've been coming in with is a little different because in every area of insurance, whether it's your home insurance, your auto insurance, your health insurance, most of the time you're spending that money without any benefit until you actually do something. So with health insurance, you're paying that premium and you only use it if you have to go to the hospital or you have to get that, dental cleaning or exam or something like that. Auto insurance, you don't actually use it unless you've been in an accident. And home insurance here in Florida, big thing because it keeps going up and up and up. And the only real benefit is if you upgrade your windows to hurricane windows and a hurricane garage, you can actually lessen your premiums, but you still don't benefit from it unless your house gets hit. In our world, that we have to look at it from the other perspective. We're spending this money to protect this stuff, and you're going to have to benefit now because at any day, that cyber attack can come, that phishing email can come in, but they feel it so much more. It's a weird little dynamic. So that's my perspective of that. But I've had to come in and start talking about, you have to stop thinking about that day's not going to come for us. It's coming for everybody.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm sure legal is not the only industry like this, right?
No.
But the thing about the legal industry is, like the financial services, right? Every industry interacts with legal, right? Business to business, right? And so you end up with a legal market that's, I think, a little bit balkanized, right? I know that in parts of the legal industry, CJIS compliance is totally unavoidable, which is the criminal justice standard from the Department of Homeland Security, and particularly if you're doing, criminal, or if you're supporting court systems, right? Or sometimes if you're even working cases for the government outside the court, sometimes you'll have access to criminal data, and you need to protect it. But that's not like. That's not the whole legal industry, right? Because there's plenty of people that don't touch a criminal anything, and there's even criminal defense attorneys that, because of the way they operate, have never had to comply with CJIS. You mentioned title attorneys, Chris. I don't know. Could you help us? Like, are there places in the legal industry that you think are super great at this, and places that are not so great at this? And how do they figure out their norms?
I mean, the ones who are best at it are going to be, your bigger companies, your companies in the financial sector, and your companies in the healthcare sector, who have just been forced into it because at that point they can do, what Marv is saying, in that you can do positive things in order to reduce your premiums and things like that, and they see this sort of incident happen. But there's large sectors of business out there in the U.S. where the owners are not particularly educated about what could happen to them, or they are just not informed about how these things occur to the point that they think, oh, it just won't happen to us. And when they think that, they haven't put anything in, and at that point, it's it's like what he said. It's putting on a new cost that they've never had before, and a lot of these, a lot of companies are living close to the margins on their profits, and they don't want to put something else in that they don't necessarily think that they have to, or they think that if something happens, it'll be something that won't really cost much or be whatever to fix, or won't have much impact. So why put in this effort?
or they think that their E&O insurance with their cyber rider is going to save them, right?
Yeah.
Which we're going to get into that deeply in the third part. But the answer is like insurers don't want to pay out even with lawyers, right? Like, so they're going to try not to. So you gotta defend yourself by doing some stuff.
I mean,
is the Panama Papers? Has everyone forgotten? Is that what's happened here? Because I thought that it was very clear what could happen to your caseload and your case flow, which is you could have none. Your firm could be done.
Well, that's the other part of it, is trying to get them to understand, why are we doing this? Because, yeah, I've seen it in the news, but it won't happen to us, right? And I have to say, no, until you implement these protections, it could happen to you. And then, of course, there's that caveat of it still could happen because nothing is 100% protection, but you obviously mitigate a lot of risk by putting protections in place. And
that thing you just said is super important and difficult, and probably is like the center of the argument, right? Which is it's not 100% protection, right?
Mhm.
And bad things could still happen. So how do you gauge what's the right amount of protection? And if you were to ask a guy in cyber with a cyber hat on 10 years ago, they would have said, well, you got to pay me 40 grand and I'm going to audit everything and I'm going to create this giant Excel spreadsheet or 20 grand, right? And I'm going to deliver you a heat map and there's going to be like all sorts of math and we're going to quantitatively figure out like you should buy this thing and you don't need to buy that thing. And I think I'm a security guy, and I'm not going to say that's total snake oil, but I am going to say that there are much easier ways to arrive at what actually is going to stop losses than creating a monster spreadsheet that maybe or maybe doesn't arrive at the right answer. So, I mean, how do you navigate that sentence, Marv? Like well, this isn't 100%, right? How do you get them to see that 80% is better than 0%, right?
well, I get them to understand. So the one argument that has always worked for me is, how much does it cost you if you can't work for a day or an hour? And once you put those things out there and they can actually identify, this is how much it costs me to employ all my people, pay the rent, pay the lights, all of that stuff, and let them know that one email could take all that out.
Mm-hmm.
And, so we need to put steps in place. So, is it just the backups? No. Is it the exterior, prevention? And that's where you have to start. And then you just take steps backwards to figure out, okay, we need to protect this. What can we do? And it's all part of the frameworks. All of the frameworks say this, I mean, the CIS, although the way that they list the 6 areas, you've got to know your environment, you've got to put in account and configuration management, blah, blah, blah. Number 5 is security awareness. You've got to educate first. That should be at the beginning as part of the, introduction onboarding. Is I, as an IT professional, need to help you with your security. It's more than just keeping your computers up and running and hear all these things. So that's part of it, and helping them understand what is this thing we call cybersecurity, and what training do we need to do, and then what steps do we need to do to protect you.
So that's the loss side of the equation. Chris, there's the other half of this thing is like, well, like there could be like an actual liability, right?
Mhm.
Outside your company. And it wasn't that many years ago that the way people figured this out was, okay, a 1-year fraud protection subscription for each of the consumers' data I lost was $25, and then it's another $8 for notice and $5 for legal. And like that was like the formula, and people would just weigh that up and be like, okay, that's my security budget, which doesn't really make any sense. But like if you actually do the math, it doesn't really work that way. But is that still how people are like cooking up the math on this?
No. No, not even close. And I mean, part of the reason is that, your notification and that, 1 year of security protection doesn't cover everything. If you're using that as your security plan and budget, you're going to put yourself in line for regulatory, fines, and some of those can be catastrophically big depending on which regulator you upset. And beyond that, you've also got lawsuits that can come from the individuals who are involved, or shareholder lawsuits that can come in. And there has been stuff that says that a board of directors can be held liable if they are disregarding to a certain extent the cybersecurity of their company. So it's if you have to do SEC filings because of the way your company is set up, there's now stuff that says that you have to report whether anyone on your board has any sort of a cybersecurity background. It's something that there's so much more to it than that. But people also forget that there's also all the reputational damage and things like that can happen because of it. If your business goes down for a day, it's going to cost you money to keep operating. But there's going to be some of your clients and some of your vendors who don't want to work with you anymore if you're down for a day. They may not be able to accept that. And if it's something that's more than that, it could cost you even more than just those very strict clients. There may be clients who you cause some sort of business impact on that they just don't trust you anymore and they don't want to work with you anymore because your security allowed this thing to happen and the business operations go down. Nothing is going to be 100% in protecting anything, especially when you have hacking groups out there like some of the APTs, the nation state actors, because if one of those top level APTs is coming after you, I don't care who you are. I don't care whether you are a top defense contractor or one of the biggest banks in the world. If one of those top APTs is coming for you, you're going to get got. And it's just a matter of how much and what it takes for you to get back up and running. So
I want to take a moment to just point at that thing you were just talking about. So it's been a while since we did an episode on this, but there are cyber criminal organizations that are much larger and more dangerous than organized crime was, here in the US in the last century. Multi-billion-dollar businesses, and they work a lot of big jobs and they work small jobs in between. These are massive organizations, right? And you might think, well, I'm too small of a target for one of those guys, but the reality is, yeah, they might have a whale they're working on, but they can hit 30 small businesses on a Monday, and that's a good Monday for them.
Oh,
right?
30 small businesses for some of these is nothing. I mean, some of these top level APTs, I mean, they are operating like full on corporations. Some of them have HR departments, and they are a fully fledged corporation with office buildings and a management structure, and they pay their taxes in the country that they operate in, and they are a fully fledged company. And so they can go and do large scale attacks after a whale going for something they really want, but they can cast a net out and they can hit hundreds, thousands of companies in a single day without a lot of problem, because now, especially with AI and some of the scanning technologies that are available, they can just go through and just the way that I try to talk to some people about it is there's the story of the two guys in the woods with a bear. They see the bear coming. One guy, he's looking scared, and the other guy goes down and ties his shoelaces. And the first guy says, "What are you doing? You can't outrun a bear." And the second guy says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." And a lot of these companies, these advanced penetration threats, they are out there looking for the easy fish to hit because it takes them less time to hit someone like that. But they're also going to go after anything that they're going to weigh out, and they're going to say, okay, it's going to take us this much effort to go after this company. This is what we have as a possible reward if we get this company, because we think we could get this amount in a ransomware payout, or we think that their information has this value to it. And they weigh it out against the amount of time and the amount of automation that they can do on it. And if you're more protected than other companies, you're in a better position to not have that happen to you.
So I
Also,
want to
remember this: hacking takes the same amount of effort to go after a whale as it does all those small businesses.
Yeah.
So in their mind, it's a win-win no matter who they hit, because hitting a small business for, 30, 40, 50 grand may not sound like a lot to them, but they didn't work that hard for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the small business, can you afford 30, 40, 50 grand, for basically, a lost day or 2 or 3?
Yeah. And they might not even care if you can pay, right? Because if they leave behind wreckage, no skin off their back, right?
Yeah, and there are some of them that have been known now to, if the opportunity to take advantage of that sort of attack in a fiscal way is available, whether it's from short selling a company or from buying stock in a competitor or doing similar things to that, they may go for companies even if the company can't pay, because they can make money in other ways at the same time. And if you can't pay, like they're doing the same thing to 100, 200, 1,000 other companies at the same time. Like they don't need them to all pay out. They just need enough of them to pay out that it ends up being worth it.
Yeah, and there's the political science here, the geopolitical science can tilt the tables even further. But I want to talk about accountability a little bit. There's this interesting thing happening in Europe right now, which I know is outside your sphere, Chris, but there's this updated EU regulation or standard, really, NIS2, and what it requires is all the member nations to go basically enact it in their individual states. And so that's happening right now. It's the major update in several years. And one of the things at the core of that is management, right? Executives can be held accountable directly. And I know in theory, that theoretically could be the case here in this country currently, but they're getting really direct about it. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, management can be held accountable. So that's going to be the new standard in Europe soon. And I know here in the U.S., we don't have just as a nation, we don't have a great track record of holding our managers in organizations accountable for the acts of those organizations. But if you're a small business, oftentimes you're more vulnerable to this than a larger business, because people may think that they're covered by a corporate veil or something like that, but it's not tied down as well as they thought it was. Their assets aren't as protected as they thought it was. I'm curious if this is something that you've had discussions with, I guess just over the years, not even in a specific position, around this personal accountability. Like if you're a business manager, like, do you personally have to worry about this stuff right now, today? And like, where do you think things are moving?
I mean, in the U.S., it's been, fairly accepted to at least a certain degree. Since at least 2019, there were cases that highlighted that boards can be held liable when their oversight of certain operational risks like cybersecurity are insufficient. But now there's way more out there about what they necessarily have to do, or things that they have to take into account, or at least things that get put into the weighing of that. And it can be as extreme as, if I remember right, it was Uber. It got very extreme because the
CISO tried to hide it under the rug, right?
The deception part of it became a big issue in that. Yeah, so it really depends on what the company is doing, but the people who aren't in it's about the fiduciary relationship. So the people who are lower down, who are managers and team members, don't have to worry about that unless they're doing something that is just, on its own, either criminal or reckless, or something that they really know that they shouldn't be doing. But the people at the very top, the upper management, who have that fiduciary duty to the company, they're the ones who do have to make sure that there is a certain level of a cybersecurity regime in place, that there are certain controls in place in order to ensure that that those sort of risks are being accounted for, because regulators and through lawsuits, they are being held accountable in the U.S.
Now, is this separate than the movement that is growing that is trying to hold, us as IT providers, managed service providers, responsible if something happens? Because I would love for there to be some sort of shared responsibility, or more responsibility put on the owner, that if we're trying to get them to do something and they say no, we have some sort of recourse, because our recourse now is just to say, well, maybe we won't do business with you. But in a lot of cases, companies don't want to do that, because that may be a big, monthly recurring revenue item that you're going to have to say goodbye to.
Well, I'm just, we just went through a transition of power here in the U.S. If I think back 20 years, I believe every single president had a cyber stump in their first 100 days of how they're going to win cyber. They're going to solve this cyber thing. They're going to pass an executive order, and cyber is going to be done.
Yeah.
And you're right. For the last 4 years, what we saw was a lot of attention on supply chain, right? And that's, service providers have been under some pressure because of that, right? And they're going to continue to be, no matter what happens at the top, because rule changes happened, right? Laws changed, right? Processes changed, and there is more attention to the people supporting the businesses, right? The people providing the IT service and support, the people providing the IT hardware and software, right? The people even that are maybe business process outsourcers, right? But are using IT in their business, right? And that supply chain risk is legally has cleared up in the last 4 years, and by contextually has cleared up in the last 4 years. I don't know what direction the next 4 years, but I can almost guarantee, I haven't gone through the whole executive order pile from this week yet, but cyber's coming. We're gonna see what where the flashlight's gonna be shining. But I think that that accountability thing is real, right? But I'm not sure that they've been holding, with some exceptions where there were some service providers that were notable. There was one in California that got caught up last year. There were some people that did some really decidedly made some poor decisions in how they're going to run their service delivery, right? Maybe they didn't have contracts in place at all. There's some other things, right? You could end up held accountable, but I think that we're going to see more of that, right? Marv, I haven't asked you on air before, and Chris, I haven't talked to you about this either, but there's been a lot of movement over the last 4 years to say, you know what, service providers maybe need their own regulatory standard, right? So there's been a lot of pushback during the Biden years, not because of Biden, because of everything that happened during those years, right? that, hey, like if the service if the supply chain is not going to be on this, right, we want the government to be on the suppliers, right, and we're going to regulate this, the IT industry, the whole IT industry, the whole MSP industry, the whole software industry, the like stuff in the cloud industry, right, these are all places where regulators have been looking and noticing where their laws are deficient. They've been in rooms, in back rooms, talking with legislators about bills that need to be worked on, rules that need to be written, and I think that that's going to continue to flow for the next few years here. But there's been talk here in the MSP industry of like, whoa, slow down, right? Like the last thing we want is the lawyers to be writing the rules here. We want to self-regulate, and I think some other industries have done that, right? Some other industries have taken responsibility, and I think if we don't do it right, it's going to be done to us, right?
Yeah, I
So,
mean, there's been a lot of push in supply chain ever since SolarWinds happened back in 2020, but and there's been a little bit of regulatory push on it from what I've seen, but most of it from what I've seen has ended up just being talk, and whether that's due to lobbying or different different legislatures not being able to come to agreements on different fine points of things. There's lots of reasons that it may not move forward, but the way that I've seen it moving forward the most is through the contractual power that the federal government especially has, because the federal government is one of the biggest technology purchasers in the world, and especially the biggest companies in the technology sector, most of them either do sell to the government or they want to sell to the government, and because of that, they have to follow the guidelines of what the federal government or state governments, what they are setting down as their standards in contractual things. And ever since SolarWinds, it's become a big push that you got to have your supply chain management, and it's big because back in 2020 when SolarWinds happened, most companies that had SolarWinds stuff integrated as part of their products didn't know it, and you get to third, fourth, fifth, nth degree relationships that I use this bit of code from this company, and their code is built on this, and their code is built on this, and their code is built on this. And you have to have an idea of what things could go wrong, and the only way to really know that is to know your supply chain. And the federal government's been pushing to get that software build of the list of essentially what makes up your product.
the software bill of materials. Yep.
Bill of materials. Yes, thank you.
Yep.
That they've been pushing for companies that are working with them to try to have that, so that the government can know, okay, this incident occurred, and this is this company's SBOM. I know that it does not include this most recent incident, so I know that one's safe from this incident.
Yeah, and I'm a cyber technology seller, and so I'm aware of some of the market data here. The federal government buys 25% of the cyber solutions in the U.S. by dollar volume. So it's 10% of the world market, 25% of the U.S. ish. It's huge. And in addition to that, what you just mentioned, Chris, which is the supply chain, right, is not just about the cyber solutions, because if you're the government and you buy from a manufacturing company that sells widgets, right, that widget company now has to come under this regulation. And this is the big fight right now, Marv, and I know you're mostly supplying legal services, but some of your brethren are being hit by this right now. The CMMC rule is coming into effect, and the current fight by the DoD is to say that MSPs servicing all those contractors, even if those contractors are like, that contract may only be like 2% of their business, right?
Yep.
But now their MSPs getting caught up in these requirements, right? So it's
Well,
really
but it's the same. I mean, we went through this with HIPAA.
yeah.
HIPAA requirements went into place, and being a business associate, meant
Yep.
that we needed to fall under that. So those things are out there. They're going to be coming, much faster, much harder for us. And the idea that you started to ask about, self-regulating is something that we've got to figure out. And we don't, there's so many different parts of our industry that it's a tough thing. It's still the Wild West for us.
So we're gonna be back here next week on your podcast, and we're gonna pick up this conversation and talk about the bad things happening. You want to give us the quick 20-second stump, and then we'll run out of here.
Yeah, well, we'll be here on is it February 5th at 8 p.m. Eastern, and I live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and the Facebook, and you'll see some stuff popping up soon for that.
I love that. It's still the Facebook for you. All right, and in the meantime, and we're missing the slide here. But in the meantime, so that's in the middle of next week, and at the end of the next week on Friday, I'm meeting with Anthony Collette, and we're going to have an interesting episode to talk about protecting our digital world today using cyber lessons from the telegraph era. Which is super interesting. All the fraud that proliferated, when telegraphs were new. It was, and we're going through it again right now. So new fraud, and I know it feels like it's new, but like what's old is new again, really. Until then, thanks everyone for joining us. See you all again soon.
Holla.